Hi, and welcome to today's episode of the Plot Luck podcast. In the second episode, we talk about the book with full spoilers. I'm Louise, and I have a YouTube channel over at Foxes and Fairy Tales.
And I'm Susan. You can find me most places at Does Susan Write. You can find all our links in the description. Welcome back to part 2 in our podcast series about Bury Our Bones in the Midnight Soil by V.E. Schwab. If you haven't read the book, stop, go back, read the book, and then come back, because we are going full spoilers here, and this is your warning. Louise, can I ask you, what was your rating? But you're not allowed to give me any explanation. I just want stars out of 5, and that is it.
Do we use points? Like, can we do quarter ratings or half ratings, or does it need to be a full number? Because, this is a whole other conundrum. Is this Goodreads or is it Storygraph?
Oh, it's Storygraph.
So what's that? I can use quarters?
Yes, you can use quarters.
Oh, okay.
But that is all no words other than... So you're allowed to say a number and a fraction then.
3.75. And the intake of breath I just saw there. Okay, so no, I'm not justifying it.
No, you're not.
What is your rating?
5.
Oh.
I'm not allowed to say anything more though.
But
so
those
it'll come through. It will come through. So in the spoiler-free section, you briefly introduced our 3 main characters, Maria, Lottie and Alice. But some of our characters have multiple names.
They do.
Do you want to talk a bit more about that, Louise?
Yeah, I think the easiest one to start with is Alice, because she's fairly consistent. She's our modern day protagonist. She's coming in the moment where this book is happening. If anything, I guess we could say she's the main character. I wouldn't say she features the most, but if we're going to say that the book is the story of events happening, I would kind of give her the protagonist role.
That's interesting.
Whereas, although the other two do feature for longer, the bulk of their story is happening in backstory.
Yes, I didn't think of her as...
Because I'm only thinking of it now because I actually would have picked a different character as being the main character because they were my favourite, and we'll get to that in a minute. But thinking about it in terms of narrative storytelling arc, I'm now tempted to say Alice is the main character. She's the protagonist. It's her actions that are pushing the story forward. It's her trying to find out more about what's happened to her that lead us to being given the rest of the information.
Yes, I hear that. But I feel she was the least developed character.
Okay, we'll go back to it. So anyway, so Alice is our Scottish student currently studying in America, and most of her storyline is happening in a relatively short space of time. It's happening current day and a tiny couple of flashbacks to her childhood. Then the next character, if we're going to then just work backwards, is Lottie, who we find out is actually Charlotte. She is our Regency era heroine who has been turned and has had a rough go of it relationship-wise. And that brings us up to where in the modern day she's Lottie. She's the one that Alice first comes into contact with.
Interestingly, she was Lottie, then Charlotte, and then Lottie again.
Yeah, that's maybe something we're going to talk about, identity.
Yeah.
And then going back to the character we come in on is originally Maria in the 1500s Spain, but very quickly becomes Sabine, which I found really interesting because without meaning to, I wasn't looking for spoilers, but the book, the hardback I have, has on any page that has their name, it has this kind of fancy scroll work. So in the book, when you're flicking through it, you can kind of see the black on those outline pages. And at one point I did thingy that Sabine was a point of view, but I hadn't started the book yet. So when we met Maria and then a different character called Sabine, I thought we were going to get a 4th character POV from Sabine. So that was quite interesting. So we do have one character who is Maria and or Sabine, depending on what point of the story you're coming in on.
And why is that she has 2 names?
So Maria is, personally, if we're gonna, I might as well get, Maria was my favourite. She was my favourite character, and she's ruthlessly determined to get out of her small town, small-minded life. And to do that, she sort of manipulates her brother and this local wealthy noble into arranging her marriage. It's a great example of these men both think that they're making the decisions and think they're getting one up on each other, but really she's the one pulling the strings. And then it turns out that marriage isn't what she hoped for. She's escaped into this better life, but she just finds herself even more trapped than she was.
Yeah, because she was poverty and then became a Viscountess.
Yeah, they were poor in that opening section, but partly because of her youth and I guess from a lack of oversight almost, she did seem to have more freedom in those very, very early chapters. She just didn't really appreciate it because she wanted more.
I think in the very early chapters, she was kind of on the cusp of childhood, young adulthood, so she possibly had had a lot of freedom as a child, and it was, she could see the cage door closing.
You very much got that idea of her as this kind of the wild youth and all that freedom that comes with pre-puberty and genderlessness. She doesn't have the trappings that suddenly start to become more clear the more of a woman she becomes. She reminded me a lot in that way of, we talked about it during the favourites, of Kathy from Wuthering Heights, where when she's young, she's kind of carefree and rebellious, and then she becomes more and more contained as she grows into womanhood. So Maria ends up in that marriage. She's miserable in it, and she meets a local apothecary presenting herself as a widow, and Sabine, who's the character she meets, introduces Maria to the idea that widowhood is its own type of freedom. We come to find out that Sabine is actually a vampire, and in the moment of turning Maria, in her greed, overeats, as we all have done, and actually kills Sabine, then takes that name for herself, and from there we are following Sabine rather than Maria.
It's like she reinvents herself.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I love that kind of moment where drinks all the blood, Sabine crumbles to dust, and Maria has this moment where obviously she's sad, but she also just seems really like narked. This, how could you? You've left me on my own, even though it was me that quite horrifically murdered you. And I really like that kind of self-obsessedness or kind of...
Sabine stands still and the world revolves around her.
Yeah, that moment where she kind of goes, who could have done this? While the camera zooms in on her.
Yeah, why is this tragic thing happening to me? Even though I caused every single part of it.
Who could have first... Yeah, and I really liked that because it does then, I feel like, filter into more of what we see of her later on. That kind of self-absorption becomes later the downfall of her. And as I said, I did think we were getting 4 POVs, but instead it is the 3. We don't quite alternate between the 3 of them, which I liked. We start very much in Maria's point of view. We filter, there's little moments of Alice as she settles into university, becomes a vampire, starts to panic and look at what's done. We gradually get more and more of Alice. We don't really get, I would say, a proper Charlotte POV until round about the middle of the book.
I think there's breadcrumbs, but I don't think... I remember being quite excited when we got her chapter, and I think her first chapter was a Lottie chapter. I'm not sure if they were all Lottie.
Yeah, there's one Lottie chapter in the current, or there's in the current day, a couple scattered through when she leaves Alice, when she goes back, she writes in her little notebook. But our kind of flashback, the first real meat that we get of her, I would say, is in the past, and it comes round about, I want to say, the middle of the book.
Yeah, I think it was quite like 40% or further. But she's Lottie in that, and then it kind of takes you through her transformation into Charlotte, which obviously Sabine turns Lottie, and Sabine decides that Lottie will now be called Charlotte. Or I think she decided that before she turned her. And then so Charlotte kind of wore the name Charlotte for a long time while she was with Sabine, before shedding it when she ran away.
And then in terms of structure, what's interesting there is that once Charlotte's POV comes in, Sabine's POV kind of fades out. We don't really see much from Sabine directly then. And the bulk of the second half of the book is alternating more between Charlotte and Alice more equally. Alice and Charlotte's importance in the book ramps up in the second half as Sabine goes under the radar, whereas the bulk of the front half of the book, I would have said, was much more Sabine's story.
Yeah, I agree. And there was quite a long section where it was just Charlotte, Lottie point of view, and it took you through. She is sent away to go and do the season because her brother and her mother realise that she's a gay woman and that's just not allowed at the time, so she needs to get married off quite quickly. But it takes you from there to the present day and her meeting Alice at the party, and then what happens after that as well. Lottie doesn't turn Alice, which I thought was quite an interesting turn of events because I just assumed...
You thought it was like a daisy chain.
Yeah, it was like, well, something must have happened and nobody noticed because they were swept up in the moment. But there must have been some way that Alice accidentally bit Lottie or something. But actually it turns out that no, Sabine just like swept in afterwards and turned her.
At the beginning, I assumed that Lottie had turned Alice because obviously that's what you're set up to believe. But I do think I cottoned on before, like a good bit before the reveal, that it was going to have been someone else. I don't think I was sure that it was Sabine, but I was fairly certain that it wasn't Charlotte. I think it'd be fun to talk about rapid fire for each of us. Who was your favourite? Who did you think was the most interesting? And who did you relate the most to? Whether those three are the same or different.
And are we talking the vampire specifically or the human version?
The entire shebang.
Okay. So
favourite.
Favourite first. My favourite human was Maria. I liked her wiliness and her refusal to bend to the patriarchy and her ultimately murdering her husband because he was abusive and horrible. Vampire, I feel that that's a really difficult one because I think we are set up, and I'm not a huge vampire book reader, I think we're kind of set up to have some empathy for Lottie. However, I think that her goodness was just a facade and she was just the same as everybody else. And her sections were very unreliable and she definitely missed out a lot of the bad things that she did, which you got snippets from other people. Her and Sabine left chaos in their wake. They murdered so many people and she was involved in that, an active participant. So Alice, again, I related to her humanness and her upbringing and all that, but her entry into vampirism just felt a bit bland and not that well developed. And it might be because we were only talking a couple of days, but if I had to choose a favourite human, I would choose Maria. Favourite vampire would be a different character. I didn't particularly like any of them, but I also didn't hate any of them, if that makes sense, which I know I did say I really love this book. I feel that they were all shades of grey.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think there's a difference between liking a character as a person and liking them as a character. You can think someone is a great character and an awful example of a human being. So when I mean like your favourite character, I guess...
Yeah, I didn't feel any of them were that...
well written.
It's not that they weren't well written. I just don't feel that any of them were that awful for me to love them. Like, I just felt they were quite human and there were a lot of shades of grey. You know, you think about your life and your friendships and your family relationships and things, and people change over time, and I feel there was change. And so I liked one at this point in their life more than I liked them at a different point in their life, and it just so happens that I would have chosen Sabine, but I didn't like her at the end point of her life. So favourite human was Maria, and none of the vampires were my favourite. I liked and loathed them in equal measure.
Okay.
What about for you?
Favourite? I'm going to go the same. Sabine/Maria was my favourite. I thought she was the most interesting. Partly that's probably because we came into the book in her POV and got quite a chunk of her all at once. You got the most time to get to know her, and that probably works in her favour. I thought she was really good fun as a character. Even as she goes through that descent into madness, I still thought she was a really compelling character. Who did you think was the most interesting character? Because it's not always the same.
I would say I think Sabine was the most interesting because she was the most honest. I think she also had the longest life, so had the most reinventions of herself. She travelled huge amounts. And I think it was really interesting when Charlotte and Sabine were together and Charlotte wanted to go to America and Sabine didn't want to go across the ocean.
Yeah, it was nice. I liked there were some moments where Schwab brings in all these different vampirism tropes it's interesting to see which tropes the author keeps, which ones they get rid of, which ones they treat almost as not something to make fun of, but what ones they make redundant or whatever. And I kind of like that, although we do have this, Sabine's like, I don't want to cross water, felt like that old trope where you go that vampires can't cross running water. But that it was a nonsense. But instead of it being a rule about all vampires, she made it just, this is a specific thing to Sabine. So you were getting that little reference back to like vampire lore, but not putting it in as vampire lore.
Yeah, that does make sense. And there was quite a lot of that sprinkled through, I would say. For me, she was definitely the most interesting, most nuanced at all points in her life, not just towards the end or in her vampire life, but in her human life as well. There was just a fearless woman kind of vibe to her where, you know, she was wild and she wanted to be free, and that carried with her whole life. So she was definitely the most interesting for me. What about you?
I would pick, I think, Charlotte as my most interesting, and I think pretty much for reasons you've touched on. That what I found fascinating about Charlotte's POV is how, looking back especially, she's such an interesting narration choice. Because, like you said, we're primed to think of her as this wilting wallflower. She's the innocent that is being corrupted and defiled by Maria / Sabine. And she presents herself almost as this victim. But when you really think about what she's telling you, one, yeah, she says basically we slaughtered all these people and I didn't have a problem with it. But then later, once she leaves Sabine, we point out that all she has to do for these human girls not to be butchered by Sabine is not have these one night stands. And yet she puts her loneliness above their lives. And yet she still paints herself as this victim. And I loved the scene at the end where we have the moment between Alice and Lottie, where Alice catches the hairbrush and knows that Lottie's plan is to kill her too. And she says about seeing that flash in her eyes that, like, for all she's presented herself as this victim, she's just as selfish as everyone else. And I just thought that was such an interesting character arc where you've got this character that's like deluding herself and everyone around her. She's presented as this innocent victim, but she's just as selfish in that there's been decades of Sabine hunting these people down. Alice, this wouldn't have happened to her if not for Charlotte. If she has it in her power to protect all of these girls and she chooses not to. Obviously, there's a lot to be said there about using Sabine and Charlotte as a metaphor for an abusive relationship. And we're not saying that because, you know, if you paint Sabine as the abuser, then it's not her actions. You can't blame Charlotte for her actions. But you also have this thing of, where is Charlotte's responsibility in that? And I just think that's such an interesting arc, however you come at it. She just did such an interesting storyline, like you say, the unreliable narration. It would be, I think, an interesting one to read back, specifically her chapters, and see maybe what you missed, knowing how ruthless and how selfish she ends up, while saying that Sabine had this deterioration, and she hasn't. But I think she probably has as well. She's just not as aware of it.
Yeah, I think that's all the reasons I didn't find her that interesting. And what was our third?
For
question?
relatability, I thought Alice was the most relatable.
As a human, yes. I can't believe I'm going to say this. I actually think Lottie was the most relatable, which I know I've just said. I hate everything about the way she presents herself. But I feel like I could relate to, if I was in that position and I was a vampire killing people, I think I would tell myself similar stories. Maybe I wasn't as surprised by the way her psychology was.
There were a few characters that I found really interesting that I really liked. I maybe would have liked to see more of, but then they might have overstayed their welcome. I think, the first one I would maybe say is Ezra? Is it Ezra?
With the coffee shop.
Yeah, with the coffee
/
shop.
bar / nightclub.
Because he was, I don't want to say like unproblematic, but for like a vampire, I find it really interesting that he's almost, or is, as old as Charlotte. He's the one that she finds and then Alice finds, and he's running, what is it, something before a coffee shop.
I think it was like a nightclub or a bar.
And then it's a coffee shop. And yet, we're told, and we see, through Charlotte and Maria, we see this, the idea that the roses, they wither over time and their humanity falls away. We see that with both of them. We're told it happens to all the vampires. But Ezra seems to be living his best life, and he seems to be fine. And I kind of found that an interesting contrast, that it almost kind of frames like our three main characters as being more, these are your main characters. Whereas Ezra's kind of there in the background, and he just seems like the kind of person who's went, none of this is my problem. I'm just going to scooch over here and get on with my life.
Do you know what's interesting about Ezra? You know, talking about Sabine's descending into madness. Lottie probably isn't that far behind her, let's be honest. But we don't see Ezra drink from a human. We only see him drink.
He's got his little coffee shop.
And you kind of say, perhaps, is there something in that when you drink from a person and kill them, there was a mention of that because soul.
We had Sabine, I think, talk about how she doesn't drink anything that's not from the source. Mm-hmm. So that's the kind of the purest. You're the drinking from the humans and the killing the humans. And then Charlotte does drink from humans, but has a lot more scruples about the killing, at least at first.
For women. She doesn't mind killing the men.
But you know what I mean? She kind of comes in. And then, like you say, we see Ezra, he's the most detached from the human element of feeding, and also seems to be holding on to his humanity the best. So yeah, I wonder if there's a kind of connection that the more and more you detach the blood from the people, does that let you hold on to your humanity longer? You could be surviving without killing, so maybe that makes it easier to hold on to your humanity, whereas the more you embrace murdering, does it degrade you faster?
Potentially, and it is that was mentioned about a piece of your soul going every time, or a piece of somebody you killed's soul going into you. There was definitely talk about soul transference, and if you're not killing, then that soul transference doesn't happen. And it actually talks, I'm going to go to a different character who I loved, Matteo and Alexandro. And Matteo seemed to have such control, and he taught Sabine, which unfortunately for the humans, Sabine then used to her advantage to make people really scared so that they tasted better. But Matteo seemed to have a lot of control, but he also had a life partner who didn't turn, but who was willing for him to feed.
He has Alessandro, then he has the rebound vampire.
The Timu Alexandro.
Yeah, bless. And does he not hightail it to America? And we never see him again.
We don't see him again. However, I'm not very good with descriptions, so I might be completely off base here. But I did wonder if him and Ezra had crossed paths at any point in time.
Yeah, I don't know. I definitely didn't pick up on anything about Matteo after he leaves Sabine. But what I had thought earlier is interesting in terms of the structure. As Charlotte kind of upswings, becomes more and more the storyteller, we see less and less from Sabine. And I did think it would be interesting. It was one of the kind of minor critiques I had about it would be that I would have liked to have seen, even if it was watered down a lot, you weren't getting big chapters, but if you got snippets of Sabine's POV in that second half to show, I guess, through the writing, you could have shown that the breakdown of her. You didn't really get that. Once she becomes the villain, you don't get into her point of view as much anymore.
You don't see the degeneration.
Yeah, I wonder if we'd seen her point of view, would we have maybe got more kind of almost cameos? Whereas because we're only getting Charlotte's POV at that point, it's not someone she's ever met. For all we know, he's running about the same city as she is, and she would never know. So in a way, the structure means that we can't learn more about Matteo's after he leaves Sabine. I don't think we find out what happens to him. But
I don't think we do.
We also don't kind of get that opportunity to.
It's like life in those days. If you did leave a companion and you both went off in opposite directions, you maybe would never hear from them again.
Yeah, what are the chances you're going to stumble across them if you've crossed an ocean? I did really like Matteo and Alessandro as a couple. I thought they were, in terms of the book, they were a nice foil to our tragic, destructive Sapphics. They've got the feeding worked out, they've got their little house, they've got their little relationship with the neighbours. They're living their cosy little vampire ideal, even though obviously Alessandro's not a vampire. They're the most functional couple I think we see. And it contrasted nicely to you seeing the disasters that are running about the place. I also really liked that Alessandro doesn't get turned. I think in most vampire books where the romance is important, yes, we maybe have Edward agonising over what he's going to do. But ultimately our human protagonists almost always end up changed either through their choice, the vampire's choice, or by authorial happenstance. We very rarely see a human fall in love with a vampire and live out to old age and die of natural causes and choose that life rather than immortality.
And I think that potentially can come back to the trope of vampires being really selfish.
I think it's a really good question because I suppose you have to think that if you have someone you love and you can have them with you forever, most people would choose that. If you're going to live forever, you have someone you're convinced that you're going to love forever, why would you let them die?
Because they want to
But
die.
that's the thing, is that it does present that kind of dilemma of, would you pick immortality? And also, would you be willing to let other people make that choice?
Yeah, I think it was a good, as you say, a good foil to coercive control.
Yeah, and I think it really humanised Matteo because he's got the vampirism down. Yeah, like you said, he's teaching Maria how to do all these fancy mind games with her prey. He's got the city on lockdown so he can basically live his life the way he wants to with very few repercussions. And yet, in that relationship, you still see that humanity in him where he's struggling to watch a loved one sicken and not being able to do anything about it. It's especially poignant because he's watching a loved one get old and die. There's nothing he can do. But he actually could. It's not like when you're watching someone you love in the hospital and being like, there's nothing I can do. Medical science has not got a solution to this. He can't do anything because Alessandro's told him not to, and he respects that. But it must be really... you must itch to take that into your own hands.
I think so, but then he wouldn't be the same person because he would now be a vampire. And he would not only be a vampire, he would be a vampire who had been betrayed by the person.
But we then see after he does die, obviously, then Matteo with the wish version of Alessandro going, well, actually, I can make a new one and it'll be fine. Which, again, like I say, that then despair and the everything is fine, I can make it okay denial that he has for that brief, really intense window. Just all of it made him feel really, really human when you contrasted it with he could have been this kind of otherworldly mentor that was almost too perfect, had it all under control. And I just thought the Alessandro storyline just kind of like brought him back down to make him feel like he had a human side.
I loved that storyline. I loved the characters. And I think their love story is where the author's kind of poetic use of language, I think it worked for me with their story in particular. It made it feel more.
It definitely had a very, like you say, kind of lyrical quality to it, especially in the aesthetic of it. That idea, again, we've talked about it being kind of quite a gothic book. The empty house as Alessandro sickens and this kind of like tragedy that's coming, and you know the tragedy's coming. You can see it right at the start there. It's kind of an inevitable tragedy, and yet you barrel towards it. And I think it did have the most kind of beautifully tragic storyline, whereas the others are a bit more active.
Yeah, and I think it is that the beautifully tragic nature of being a human.
Yeah, it definitely felt like it was the most melancholic of the stories. So all three of those characters, all three of their stories, their problems, their interactions, all come to a head by the 3/4 mark when we go into what I personally would consider the finale. I know obviously you've said that.
Yeah, I have a slightly different take on when I think the finale starts, because I think the finale starts with the start of Alice's story, and it's just woven through in a different way. So it's that kind of story versus book, maybe.
We'll see this point actually. Now we've talked about it a little more. On reflection, because I'm not saying I got it at the time, on reflection, I feel that Alice is the main character. So what you're saying, that the start of her story you see is the finale, it is the finale of Sabine and Charlotte's story. Alice coming into it is what changes their world, and she's very much the start of the finale. But now that I'm thinking about the book and thinking of Alice as being the main character for the length of time we're with them in the book, I would say the finale comes at the point where Alice and Charlotte have that little conversation where Charlotte's like, yo, I can do nothing about this situation. Maybe my tiny little newborn princess, you could go and, fix this for me. And from there, through that kind of snowball ending, I would call the finale of the book, because it's the finale of Alice's story, and it's the finale, I think, of them as a trio. Whereas, like you said, the entire book potentially is the finale of Charlotte and Sabine, because they obviously have a much broader timeline we're working with. Their finale can be a lot longer and still proportionally be the same.
It is interesting because I would view Sabine as being the main character.
I would have picked Maria as the main character while I was reading, and probably at the start, probably because we spend so much time with her at the beginning. Her story is so weighted at the beginning, so I think that sets it up to feel like she's the main character, and she maybe is the character with the most page time.
She has main character energy.
She does. But I think if we're talking about this particular story told in this particular book, not the world of the book, then I still would make the case that Alice is our main character, and the finale comes when the three of them come into conflict right at the end.
Yeah, I think I could maybe agree with you if I didn't find Alice to be the least interesting.
I didn't particularly find that interesting, and I did think for most of her section I found her a bit whiny, a bit annoying. But I also wonder whether, I don't think it's intentional in the sense of I don't think she's doing something clever with it, but I wonder how much of that is the fact that we are still kind of coming out of that 90s, 2000s era where the not like other girls and the Buffy the Vampire Slayer, she's the actiony one, she thinks, and Alice still a bit wishy-washy and a bit weak. But I think partly that's because we're still in that thing of the action girl heroines. She's maybe not wishy-washy and weak, she's more realistic. The other two are almost hyper examples of fight like a girl, go girl go, girl power 90s.
Yeah.
She can, I support women's wrongs. And then Alice, I actually feel, might be the more realistic take. But in this world, where she's up against such powerful, such dynamic characters, she kind of feels like the least interesting.
Potentially. I think she was just a bit apathetic and let things happen to her as well, though. She was led by her sister basically her whole life. And then she went to Boston because her mum had been there. And then she went to a party she didn't really want to go to. Lottie seduced her. She got made into a vampire. And then she had to kill that boy, but it's fine because he was really annoying anyway, or whatever he was. And it just kind of felt like lack of agency.
After that, though, I would say she got quite her agency up, if you think about it, because then she was investigating. She's looking for Lottie. She's going about town. She's finding out things. I did think then it doesn't play as dramatically as the other two, but she actually probably did more to solve the problems she saw herself with than Charlotte did. Because Charlotte almost runs away. She sticks her head in the sand. She tells herself she's doing everything she can while actually setting up all those girls for whatever Sabine does to them. Whereas it's not as dramatic, but I do think Alice takes more concrete steps once she starts to look into the vampirism. She's tracking them through the city. She's following the clues. She's finding them. It's not as dramatic or as interesting, but I would say actually she might be displaying a bit more of kind of gumption and agency.
Possibly. I guess it's a different time that she was raised as well, so she should have that. I just think, I can't believe she actually believed when Lottie said, oh, if you kill Sabine, you'll come back to life. Well, if you haven't turned, you haven't drank blood, you haven't killed anybody yet. Well, she had done all of those things.
Just say because it's not been enough time.
Yeah.
Which is a bit wishy-washy. And I think I did at that point, I went, oh,
no,
Victoria, we're going to have issues. Because that's the thing with vampire books. There's so much, and it goes back to where each author, I guess, creates their own vampire mythology. What bits you're going to choose to have. Do they have the reflections? Do they need to be... Are they falling asleep as soon as the sun rises, or can they just put out some heavy curtains? Does it affect them, or is it that they burst into flames, or like this? Is it a kind of a weird, the malaise that kind of comes over? I guess it depends what you want. So it could have work in the world building of the book. I just thought even if it did, it was far too easy. It was far too much of a kind of Hail Mary right at the end to be like, oh, here's the solution to all your problems.
I love that the author tricked you there. Made you worried that it was going to be really...
Yeah, exactly, which is good. My problem with the finale as a whole is that I just thought it was all far too easy. We are set up that Sabine has been, she's this ancient vampire. Charlotte, I know there's that promise that she makes that she can't hurt her, but Sabine has almost become this kind of caricature of a villain. No one can stop her. She's slaughtering people throughout the country. And then Alice, who is still the equivalent of like, what, a newborn baby. And she just kind of saunters in and goes, and you're done. Like, it just felt like there was no real struggle. It was so easy. That victory was just kind of handed to her on a plate, because I almost felt like we got to a point where Schwab went, oh, fiddlesticks. I've written 460 pages and I need to wrap this up. But also, how do you wrap that up? Because you set Sabine up to be this caricature of a villain. I don't believe that Alice has the physical strength or whatever to overpower her. So it has to become that she outsmarts her. But the outsmarting her is just like, what if I just like went for a shower and then stabbed her in the neck? And I just felt like it came so easily.
It did, but what I took from that was Sabine is in cognitive decline. So what didn't have her wits about her and was acting on impulse a lot of the time. So she was basically like, Lottie slept with that person. I'm going to turn them into a vampire. And she'd done it so often, it was just a ritual that she followed. So actually, although Alice did overpower her, she didn't overpower Sabine at her peak. She kind of overpowered a much later version that possibly was at the stage of not being able to experience new things in new ways.
So then the kind of secondary finale is then obviously between Charlotte and Alice. And again, I just thought it was, I did say that I loved that moment where the true Charlotte is revealed, that Alice sees it in her eyes. She sees that for all this bluster, Charlotte has been just as ruthless and mercenary as everyone else. Loved that moment. Did find it just far too like easy that Charlotte went, oh, this blood that you've conveniently put out that was the plan to kill Sabine, that obviously didn't work. I'll just have a quick swig of this, why don't I? And I just thought that it just all felt a bit like too easy. She takes out these two much older than her vampires while she's still struggling to walk, basically. And I just thought, if you're going to have vampires, they're supposed to be powerful. They're supposed to be... The idea that, like, this uni student that's still hungover from her last bender is able to come in and take out these centuries-old creatures without any real effort. You can make arguments for their decline and stuff. But in the amount of space we had developed the book for, I just felt it was too easy a conclusion. It just kind of, like, wrapped things up without feeling like it had the right amount of weight for the time we'd put in to get there.
Yeah, I think a point I would maybe like to make, and it's not fully formed in my head yet, so it might come out wrong, but is that an example of people underestimating young women?
I mean, potentially.
Because Lottie acted in a pretty stupid way and made an assumption that she wasn't in any danger, whereas she was, but only because of her own stupidity.
I think maybe the answer to that depends on how much credit we give the author. It could be an intentional comment on underestimating young women, or it could just be that she had to reach a conclusion and that's what she did.
So if I was to come back to the podcast I listened that the author had said, one of the things she talked about being inspirational for her writing the book was the violence in being female, being fed, and what comes with that and how people treat you, predator versus prey. So I might be reading too much into it, but I do wonder if there's how females and femmes move through the world and how they're viewed even by others who are like them.
I suppose so. Bringing it back to that, I said I found Alice to be most relatable and you said you found her to be kind of lacking as a character. If it's intentional and the point of that easy victory is to be like, we underestimate young women, is that also part of then we as the reader are kind of underestimating Alice because she is a young woman and whereas the other two are these mythical creatures, are we kind of going, oh, she's the least interesting just because she's just a young girl?
Yeah, and we have the time we spend with her in the present day is so short and the worst point in her life / death.
There's a lot to be probably looked back on, and there's probably a lot you could analyse about each of the characters. I said Maria I enjoyed the most. I definitely felt like She was the main character at the beginning, and she was the most entertaining. I don't know, looking back, whether she's the most nuanced or whether actually one of the characters like Charlotte or Alice that maybe isn't as compelling a character as you're reading it, but maybe is the one that's making cultural, social points more.
Okay, so let's come back to our ratings from the start. We're going to have 60 seconds each to explain our ratings and anything else that we haven't had the chance to talk about.
Okay.
Will I set the timer?
Yeah, go for it. So having discussed this, I would maybe put my rating up slightly from the 3.75 to a 4. I still don't think V.E. Schwab has won me over as an author. I still think I'm not likely to pick up her books in the future unless the premise absolutely ticks all my boxes. But I do think this one connected for me more than her previous ones. Partly, though, that might have been because it was longer, so I spent longer in the world, and because I did make a point of eking this out over however many days rather than reading it in the space of kind of one big go. How long did it take?
You've still got 20 seconds.
And I can't think of anything else now. But yeah, I think it's the best V.E. Schwab I've read.
High
but
praise.
The bar might
or
not
low praise.
be that high, yeah.
Would you read Addie?
I think the moment's passed. Let's see if when Addie was popular and I was really, really tempted by it, but now enough time's passed and the hype's gone down that I wouldn't be willing to spend the time reading it when I'm fairly confident that I'm not going to love it.
Fair enough.
So will I set a timer for you now?
Yes.
I kind of feel like you might have prepped this already, though.
I haven't. I can assure you, I'm not quite sure what's going to come out of my mouth. So I'm still quite happy with my 5-star rating. And I don't know if I've talked about this in previous episodes. 5 stars to me doesn't mean this is a perfect book. It means that I had feelings, I had a bit of a hangover after reading it, and it means that I did enjoy it, is the wrong word, I was engaged with it the whole time. I read it not in 50-page snippets, but in 40-page snippets on the way to and from work, on the train, so it was quite a nice way to start and end my workday. Didn't love the characters, really. I did enjoy the storylines, but they were quite lyrical, poetic, meandering. And when I'm in the mood for that, that is perfect. I think it was just full of vibes, is what I would say. How am I doing for time?
You are 53 seconds, so
Oh.
you're pretty much bang on.
So, yeah, I enjoyed it, and I loved Addie LaRue, so.
And that's you perfectly on 1 minute. This was, I guess, more of a success for you than Hungerstone.
Definitely. And if we had done the ratings for Hungerstone, I would go back and change that one. I think I would take a whole half point off.
I can't actually remember what I said Hungerstone was when we recorded it, but I would say I preferred this to Hungerstone. I think I read Hungerstone more quickly, so again, there's maybe a slight recency bias and like length of time it took you to read the book bias. But I did think this one felt more like a vampire book to me. I definitely remember we talked about that with Hungerstone. Yeah, it's Carmilla, but the vampirism is very metaphorical. It did a great job with that, but I wanted more arg biting of necks vampirism.
Yeah.
I didn't want it necessarily as a metaphor for industry and whatever else we were using it for. This felt more like a vampire book to me.
I agree. There was lots of arg, as we say. And there was that element of, Lottie justifying her choices, Sabine not caring whatsoever, and then Alice, I guess, on her journey to understand, that sort of philosophical journey almost of understanding what had happened to her, why, and then finding out it was just a spurned ex-lover.
It's interesting and tragic that Alice spends most of the current day section of the book looking for someone to help her. She's looking for community or a mentor or someone to show her what to do next. Like you said, she almost feels like in the moments where you could consider she's lacking in agency, what she's looking for is someone to tell her what to do, much like she had with Catty. And by the end of the book, what she ends up doing is essentially removing the two people that would be the most likely to fill that role, and she ends up entirely on her own. So she doesn't really get what she's been aiming for, but also does that actually set her up better than, for instance, Charlotte, who had someone to tell her what to do for a long time, but that person was Sabine. And I guess where does Alice go next? Is she in a better position than Charlotte was at that point? Or, you know.
I think she probably has a better understanding of what can go wrong.
Yeah, like that thing of it being with someone that's bad for you versus being on your own. Alice, yes, she's going to be on her own. She's got to figure now everything out for herself. But at least
She's safer.
she's doing it kind of point zero rather than Charlotte, by the time she got to there, already had all this baggage hanging over her.
Yeah.
So I guess, yeah, there's quite a lot of interesting things in it, which is why I would put it up slightly from my earlier rating, because I do think there's a lot that once you get to the end, you can look back on it. If I enjoyed the book more, it might be one that would be interesting to reread, but I didn't enjoy it enough to want to reread it to do that.
I won't be rereading it. It was too meandering for me to read again. If I read a book again, it doesn't have to be a 5-star book. My rating system's all over the place. But I could happily read a 3-star book again.
Oh yeah, I'm into ratings entirely vibes.
So, yeah.
And I refuse to be tied to them after the fact. But like, I hated every minute of it 5 stars.
Yeah, pretty much. Again, maybe it's about engagement.
Yeah.
It engaged me.
And in that particular moment.
So on that note, let's hope our next book is
Yes.
as engaging.
Which is Atmosphere by Taylor Jenkins Reid.
So I think that was my choice again, was it?
It was, yes. But I will say it's a sneaky one because, yes, it was your choice. But I would probably have picked it up anyway if you hadn't suggested it.
Interesting. Without giving spoilers away, it's a book about astronauts and space, which I did not realise when I chose the book. I assumed it would be about atmosphere on like a rock stage or an acting stage or something because of the books I've read from Taylor Jenkins Reid before.
Well, for anyone else who hasn't read the summary yet, Joan Goodwin has been obsessed with the stars for as long as she can remember. Thoughtful and reserved, Joan is content with her life as a professor of physics and astronomy at Rice University and as aunt to her precocious niece Frances. That is until she comes across an advertisement seeking the first women scientist to join NASA's Space Shuttle program. Suddenly, Joan burns to be one of the few people to go to space. Selected from a pool of thousands of applicants in the summer of 1980, Joan begins training at Houston's Johnson Space Center along with an exceptional group of fellow candidates. Top Gun pilot Hank Redmond and scientist John Griffin, who are kind and easygoing even when the stakes are highest. Mission specialist Lydia Danes, who has worked too hard to play nice. Warm-hearted Donna Fitzgerald, who is navigating her own secrets. And Vanessa Ford, the magnetic and mysterious aeronautical engineer who can fix any engine and fly any plane. As the new astronauts become unlikely friends and prepare for their first flights, Joan finds a passion and a love she never imagined. In this new light, Joan begins to question everything she thinks she knows about her place in the observable universe. Then, in December of 1984, on mission STSLR9, it all changes in an instant.
Okay, it sounds a bit more interesting than the way I described it. It's a book about space.
See, that's you've not got that writer's moment that
Yeah.
Taylor Jenkins Reid has, that she can make it sound.
This is why I read the books and don't write them. Well, looking forward to that. Remember, like, follow, subscribe, leave us a comment. Have you read Bury Your Bones in the Midnight Soil? And if so, who is your kiss, marry, kill from the 3 main characters?
See you next time. Goodbye.
Bye.